Hello, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted by Barber Library. My name is Michelle Spomer, and I'm the director of Barber Library. Tisha Wu, our user services librarian, will also be joining us behind the scenes to monitor Q&A and also provide links in Zoom chat. So before we start, I have just a few housekeeping matters to cover. First, we are posting bookshop.org and Amazon links in chat for those of you who wish to buy John Cleghorn's book. Of course, those of you who are local can come to Barber Library and check out the book if you have a library account. And if you didn't know, library accounts are available to anyone who is local for just a small annual fee. Also, we are posting a link to an online subject guide developed for this book talk, which includes books, journal articles, and websites that will help you explore this and related topics. This excellent guide was created by our user services librarian, Tisha Wu. She has also set up a related book display in the library, which includes bibliography handouts that you can take with you. Please be aware that this book talk will be recorded and then posted in a couple of places. We will provide links for these places at the end of the book talk. You may want to view the live transcription during the book talk, which you can see by clicking the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we invite you to do this throughout the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button also at the bottom of your screen and then entering your question. Lastly, I'd like to thank our communication staff, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who helped us immensely with advertising and registration. I'd also like to thank the fabulous Bobby Jarsulik for being our Book Talk ever-present tech support person. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Shan Overton, our previous Book Talk collaborator and Writing Center director, who was a wonderful conversation partner and who helped to shape our Book Talk programming. All right, so our author today is the Reverend Dr. John Cleghorn. He will be having a conversation with Dr. Tanner Capps about his book, Resurrecting Church, Where Justice and Diversity Meet Radical Welcome and Healing Hope. John Cleghorn is the pastor of Caldwell Presbyterian Church in the Elizabeth neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. John has served the church since 2008. John is also a 2017 graduate of the Doctor of Ministry degree program here at Pittsburgh Seminary, and his Doctor of Ministry thesis is entitled Church at the Galatians Crossroads, the Possibilities and Potential Pitfalls of the Intersectional Church in the PC USA. And this can be checked out from Barber Library. Dr. Tanner Capps, who will be John's conversation partner, is the director of the Miller Summer Youth Institute here at Pittsburgh Seminary. And I'll let him share a little bit more about their connection. So for those of you who may not have read John's book, Resurrecting Church has three interweaving strands. First, it is the remarkable turnaround story of Caldwell Presbyterian Church, which was on the brink of extinction when John filled the role of pastor. Second, John tells a story of his own growth and liberation from the myopia of privilege. He traded his position as senior vice president of the nation's largest bank for ministry and the dusty, dated church office at Caldwell Presbyterian. The third strand includes the stories of several diverse congregations researched by John. These congregations are examples of faith communities that have taken risks, deepened their empathy, and are seeking justice. Through their stories, the book updates the same old conversation about church vitality in timely and surprising ways. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tanner Capps and the Reverend Dr. John Cleghorn.
Thanks, Michelle. Great to be with y'all tonight and with my friend John Cleghorn in conversation about his book. Michelle asked that I say a little bit about our background together, and really, I've been thinking about it. My path to Pittsburgh Seminary kind of started with the Gambrel Fellows and Social Justice program at Caldwell Presbyterian Church. When I was teaching undergraduates, I was sending students to that program, and I would come down occasionally in the summer and see them have lunch, teach a little bit with John and some of his staff. And it was that program where I saw a living learning community, like really in action. And that was an inspirational thing to me. And we're trying to do something similar here. And it was already going on, but here through the Miller Summer Youth Institute at the seminary. So John, I thank you for that. And I guess we've known each other since 2016, 2017, thereabouts. Does that sound right? Yeah. Well, great. Well, I want to start with a few questions about the background to the book and where it came from and the genesis of the project. But I'm going to start on page 3 from the intro, where you have a subsection titled "My Own Liberation." And yeah, I'll just read it. So this book, you say, is a story of your liberation. In many ways, you say, you might be a poster child of the PCUSA and even mainline Protestantism in general. You're white, straight, cisgendered, privileged, educated, financially comfortable, and rich in social capital. And then if you were to extrapolate your age against the numerical decline of our denomination, assuming nothing with the church changes, you might be the one that turns the lights out on the PCUSA before going on to God. So I'm fascinated by that language of this being a book also about your liberation and not just about resurrecting Caldwell. So can you talk a little bit about your path into ministry, the non-traditional path that you may have taken, and what you mean by liberation as part of your story?
Well, thank you. And Tanner, it's great to be with you and to be in conspiracy with you again now and ongoing. And thank you for everybody at Pittsburgh. It's just been wonderful to help make this happen. It's wonderful to be with you all. And let's see, to your question. Yeah, one of the very tired jokes I repeat in the book is, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. And my first 2 careers were journalism, and then using those same kinds of abilities in corporate work. And they were great and informative and gave me experiences and skills, but God kept tugging at me from time to time. And I kept listening from time to time, but then 2 children and a mortgage and all that adult stuff came along. And then when Union Presbyterian Seminary opened a branch in Charlotte, that was my exit ramp out of corporate life. I had thought about trying to go to Duke or Columbia, but that wouldn't work because, again, I needed to keep making a paycheck. And so the beauty of the design of the Union Charlotte campus is it's weekends and nights. And so that allowed me, that was God basically hitting me with a 4x4 and saying I was really out of excuses, that 2 miles from my front door was a seminary that was open on Saturdays. And that was the first part of my liberation. And yeah, liberation and resurrection kind of dance together, I think, both theologically and in my experience. I probably wouldn't have used that word liberation 15, 20 years ago as I was just getting into this.
Yep.
But this context has shown me that, and that we all grow up with blind spots and blinders on, and we're all captive in some ways of our own experience. And so God, in her infinite wisdom, plopped me down in a wonderful mix of people, and I knew I had to start to tear those scales off my eyes as quickly as I could, or certainly ask God to. Yeah. And that process is ongoing. It's never ending.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit about Caldwell as you found it. Was Caldwell your first call?
It was.
Okay.
Caldwell was a very traditional church. Started in 1912. Was one group very quickly in Charlotte to become one of the most prominent Presbyterian churches in a Presbyterian town.
Right.
Grew up to 1,100 members, but then the neighborhood around it started to change. White flight, urbanization, the arrival of the car, suburbanization of the city, newer and fancier Presbyterian churches opened up, and it went on about a 50-year slide from 1,100 members to 12.
Right.
And
and we're talking like, when did the decline to where y'all can locate in membership? Is this 1940s?
well,
50s,
it's a parallel line to the PCUSA.
right.
So you can draw the same line up to about 60, and then it turns downward, and the same thing for Caldwell. For some overlapping reasons, but some different reasons as well. The church held on for as long as it possibly could. The last 15 or 12 members that were there had seen all of their peers leave. They had decided, well, we'll leave feet first, but otherwise we are not going to leave. They really wanted to give God every chance to do a new thing, until finally the money ran out. They were paying a part-time supply pastor out of the organ repair fund, and
Wow.
Finally voted to close the church. And at that time, an interracial couple who was connected with another group that had been holding Sunday school in the building, completely apart from the life of the congregation, happened to be in the pews. And they felt called, even before hearing the church was about to close, they had felt called to join the church that day, just because they had been so well received by the blue-haired octogenarian proper Calvinists that were there. And then God kind of got, the spirit blew, and a variety of factors led to the church rebounding. And that was 06, 07. And it has grown in different waves for different reasons since. We're up to about the community of faith of about 350 now, and are stable and very, very, very busy with what we hope we're discerning God wants us to be doing.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm from the South. I grew up not too far from Charlotte. I know a bit, of course, about the story of Charlotte and it becoming a boom town around banking and the financial sector. For those not familiar with the kind of New South concept and what was going on in places like Charlotte or Atlanta, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Charlotte, or at least the sort of later 20th century history of Charlotte, and how Caldwell found itself embedded in that and challenged by that? Can you talk a little bit about Charlotte itself as a city in the New South?
That's a strong parallel. So it's great context. Absolutely. Charlotte grew up very quickly from being really just the intersection of a couple of old indigenous trading paths, and the Civil War didn't come through Charlotte. So there was not a lot to rebuild, like in some places like Atlanta or Richmond. So Charlotte was able to get back on its feet quickly, and really became a business, a merchant's town, a trades town. In the 1900s, textiles became the manufacturing base for Charlotte in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and from there, transportation, from there, banking. And there's a whole long story about how the lack of North Carolina had never did hinder how banks could spread. It was the absence of a law that existed in a lot of other states. And so the banks figured out how to run statewide franchises, and then through some legislative changes, were ahead of the game in learning how to run big franchises. So they led the pack, or among the leaders, at least, in growing big nationwide banks. Since then, healthcare and tech and some other things have helped. So Charlotte is very much a business town. Raleigh is the legislative capital, but Charlotte is the economic hub of the Carolinas, and is a go-go city. It pauses sometimes, but it hardly ever goes backward, and it just goes from boom to boom with slight pauses in between. Caldwell's makeup was very much the merchant class.
Yep.
Business people who owned retail stores or companies were a big part of the base of the membership. Caldwell was kind of a traditional Calvinist, white, straight Presbyterian church.
Right.
And its decline could be attributable to a lot of things, and I can only infer from what I think I know. But Charlotte is still very much a Presbyterian town.
Yeah.
Religion is receding to the margins in Charlotte, just like everywhere else. But back in the 80s, 2/3 of the Charlotte City Council were in the same Presbyterian church at Myers Park. So its roots and its culture are very Presbyterian and therefore pretty white and
Yep.
therefore pretty privileged. However, after the Civil War, the Northern Presbyterians came down and began opening black churches as quickly as they could. And so Charlotte has this wonderful mix of black Presbyterian churches as well, thanks to our northern neighbors.
Yep.
The Presbytery later merged. And so we're blessed with that as well. But Charlotte is very much facing all of the challenges to organized religion that you see every day.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, I know we'll talk about it in just a little bit, the kind of next phase of the work of Caldwell. But my students, when they would come and work in your summer program, I mean, y'all were dealing with some of the hardcore issues. I mean, Charlotte's a boom town. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of challenges, and the students were working on projects in gentrification, HIV and AIDS, healthcare, displacement. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I know that's part of the story of the entire book. So for folks who want to read it, I don't want to give much away, but can you talk about how that work, it really got y'all from the point of like 12 members, I'm about to close the church, to this new revitalization, what you call resurrection.
All resurrection is due to the Lord Almighty. So we'll start there. The congregation that reformed around the old Blue Hairs, and we loved them to death, and we're down to just only one remaining original member now.
Wow.
But we were intentional in starting with a blank slate and saying the church never really closed, but we're rebooting.
Yeah.
And so the older folks did not do what a lot of churches do, and that is impose lots of rules. Well, you only can do it this way. You can only do it that way. Certain families have to be on the session. You have to save this room for Wednesday afternoon bridge, even though no one's used it for Wednesday afternoon bridge for 30 years because they're all dead. A lot of churches impose those old dead crustacean kind of rules. The beautiful thing about the remnant of the original congregation is they didn't. And so they greeted the new crowd as it came in, black and white and straight and gay and trans and homeless and millionaire and everything in between.
Yep.
And they basically said, okay, if we can agree on Jesus, we'll go from there. And they did. And social justice was very much at the heart of the folks that came to revive Caldwell. And they would have it no other way. And in fact, I think that was authentic to who they were in their spirits and their understanding of faith in Christ. If you were to look at it, if you were to look at the telescope backwards, you might say, well, that was smart marketing because Charlotte did not have a highly progressive, highly missional church. And so we were offering something on the buffet of churches in Charlotte that was not there. That was not the intent. That would be false if it were not really core to the authentic spirit of the church. But this congregation doesn't hesitate to dive into the hard stuff and holds me accountable and to ensure that we're always doing that and always pushing the boundaries. And in part because our membership manifests that. Whatever experience of the marginalized is probably represented in our pews, as well as a lot of privilege and power. And so we rub those two things together.
Well, I want to continue on that for just a second. I'm going to page 125 in the book. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that it was not a feel-good, fun story of just a bunch of people getting together and having a bunch of good meals and picking up the pieces and starting this, incredible new thing that the Spirit was doing in your midst. Y'all had to do some hard self-work. And it's a Southern church. And so it's a Southern Presbyterian church. And so at the bottom of 125, I'll read through this. Y'all were doing some work on the identity of the church and the DNA of the church, as it were. And here's something that you say, in doing this self-work on the congregations, sort of excavating its history, we learned that the church had begun its life as John Knox Presbyterian in 1912. 10 years later, a childless widow, Sally Caldwell White, left $50,000 to the church to honor her parents, David and Edith Caldwell. That's $750,000, probably more now than when you wrote that in today's dollars. The session renamed the church Caldwell Memorial. There are a lot of these in the South, these memorial churches.
Right.
Honor the family and gratitude for the transformative gift then the funds were used in 1922 to build the classic sanctuary that has hosted worship ever since. And then you have a pause in the text. Who were the namesake, the Caldwells? And this is where y'all have to get into family and kinship and some really hard history. Can you tell us, I could keep reading where you actually tell the story, but tell us what that was like to excavate that history, because the family, the Caldwell family, their Southern family on the outskirts of Charlotte up on the Catawba River, and y'all learned some stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Well, thank you. And that has been such a profound part of our journey and still is. Singular credit to an elder named Beth Van Gort, who called the question. It was, I suppose it's kind of ironic and it might almost seem strange, but when the church did come back to life and got so busy, I mean, within a couple of years, we were hosting a 50-bed homeless shelter on campus, and we just didn't slow down and say, well, wait a minute, the Caldwells. And the remnant folks, they were dying. They never really told us. And so Beth Van Gort was on the session at the time and said, we need to understand our history.
Yep.
And she read 100 years of session minutes, and then every month would give us kind of 20 years at a chunk. And it was full of revelation. And because everybody at Caldwell is new since 2006, 2007.
Right.
We didn't have any institutional memory.
Yeah.
And it was like we were opening closet doors, wondering what was behind things, which we also did around the campus.
Yep.
And Beth found that indeed this fortune had been left to a single childless widow from a slave owning plantation.
Right.
And that shook the church.
Yep.
And it still shakes the church.
Yep.
I think white folks and black folks receive that differently. I think we're about 15 to 20% people of color. They obviously receive that news with very different ears and hearts and minds and souls than the white folks.
Yes.
And
sorry, someone just walked in on me.
It's all right. You're always teaching, doctor. Yeah. You're always teaching. And so that had to settle in over time.
Right.
And quite frankly, we did give it some time just to digest it. And now we learn out of it in different ways. It is a very present reality. We start worship every Sunday with marking the place, both starting with a land acknowledgement and then adding to that land acknowledgement that the property was taken from the Catawba and the Sugaree and the Waxhaw peoples. But then in the 20s, when the church was started, the real estate where the land is, the real estate where the church is, was race restricted by deed. People of color could not own homes in that rich neighborhood. It was just coming out of the ground near the new trolley line in the teens. And then in 22, they changed the name to Caldwell Memorial. And so we have been wrestling with what do you do with that, and how does that inform our journey today. And so we start worship by acknowledging that the beautiful sanctuary that we worship in was paid for by the blood, sweat, tears, lives, and deaths of kidnapped, enslaved Africans. And that's heavy, but we try to keep it in front of us. We're imperfect in how we do all this, but the congregation, to its great credit, doesn't shy away from this stuff.
Well, and that's where, if I can point out, I mean, the thing that I love so much about the congregation and the work that y'all have done together is you take words seriously. Words matter. And one of the things that you point out on page 127 is that language of memorial has dropped out of the self-description of the church. And it reminded me, I mean, it made me think, the book's Resurrecting Church, but it's also about putting things to death, like things that need to die, right? So that the new thing can come into being, so that God can do the work in the new thing. And so I don't know if you have any response to that, or if you could like that one word memorial. I mean, like you said, years and years, just pass over it, right? Like, well, we don't know. It just became the session voted on it, whatever. But why is that so important that language of memorial begin to drop out as one piece of the work of putting a thing to death so that the new thing can come into being?
Well, to be utterly honest, before we knew the family story, we had kind of tried to shorten the name just in general, because it was such a mouthful. But when we understood who the Caldwells were, we're not erasing history, but we don't want to go around being known as a church that is still in memorial of folks that owned a plantation and made their money that way. And then there's a very fascinating little nuance to it, and we try to be highly respectful around this too. We're even with a shortened name to Caldwell Presbyterian, we're not the first. The first Caldwell Presbyterian church was started in 1867 by Northern Presbyterians who came down, and apparently the Caldwell family gave them their formerly enslaved people a plot of land. And so the first Caldwell Presbyterian church, way before there was a Caldwell Memorial, was a church of formerly enslaved people. And it was then merged into two other churches. It's part of their lineage is part of the Catawba Presbyterian Church, which is still an active Black church in Charlotte. So, God gave us kind of a multifaceted thing to just continue to turn and turn and turn. And after I handed in the manuscript, I felt compelled to add the post log of this business of what do we do with this name. And I would say the congregation is still chewing on that. Just earlier this week, Davidson College announced that it was not going to change the name of one of its buildings, who was a major donor and made an enormous amount of money from slavery. They've kept the name because they don't want to erase the history. They want to contextualize it and live it out. And we're still trying to do that. I would still hope that we can put something. COVID got in our way, and then we got some other really big things happening. But I personally will still hope that we put something that is some sort of a public acknowledgement that even people walking down the sidewalk can see and know.
It's the work of, you're setting up for years to come, right? This is work of discernment that goes well beyond your ministry or anyone that's there. So beautiful.
And it can't be done too fast. And I'm an impatient, privileged white guy. And one of the more magical moments was when I called this question for the session to consider, and one of our members of, and I even put a timeline on it. I said, can we let's at least, in 9 or 12 months, figure out what we might want to do. And one of our members of college just said, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't put a timeline on this kind of thing. And he was so right. And I
Yep.
was so wrong. So I'm still getting taught.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back in the book now. So we kind of dug in a little bit to the history. I'm trying to be mindful of time too, but I want to zoom out a little bit to page 14. And you have what's really kind of an admonishment to the churches, as it were. You say, this is where you sort of summarize what's the book about, but you say the major thrust of this book is twofold. First, to point out that we, the church, have an enormous amount of work to do to open God's church more widely, talking about capacity and capaciousness. And second, to point to congregations and their leaders who are living all of this out of their daily intersectional both and life together, and this both and concept being central to the argument of the book. But this is where I really wanted to look at it with you and get you to say a little bit more. In these places, perhaps not by name per se, the intersectional church has been taking shape. It's already been happening. This is the work of the Spirit that you point out the good theology here. Often in overlooked and forgotten neighborhoods such as Baltimore, Atlanta, Brooklyn, Charlotte, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Denver, suburban Chicago, and Detroit, God is fueling a unique expression, an energy, and a recreation. This path can inform congregations yearning to heat up our old, beloved, frozen chosen. So what do you see as, I mean, I don't want to push you to be overly prescriptive here, but what do you see as the framework, the way that this work can be done in Pittsburgh, in Detroit, in what do you, if you could generalize a little bit, how does this resurrecting church framework that you're developing, this theology, begin to map into the practical day-to-day work?
Well, you're kind of saying I'm developing it, but I learned it, quite frankly, when I realized that I had this unusual congregation, and I grew up in a very white bread, Wonder Bread kind of Presbyterian church. There were no conversation partners for me anywhere nearby. And so thanks to Dr. Leanna Fuller of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, I used my doctoral thesis to go find other churches that had this same overlap of color and identity and sexuality, and white folks from a variety of backgrounds. And so then I learned from them what they are doing, because some of us, as you said, have been at work for some time. East Liberty there in Pittsburgh, right down the street, is an extraordinary example of a church that has turned itself inside out and upside down.
Yeah. And
the latter chapters of the book sort of get into that, but that's just it. It was fascinating. I didn't know this going in, but most of the churches that passed this kind of criteria of being at least 20% people of color, at least 20% LGBTQ, and then something else, I found 10 of those out of 10,000 Presbyterian churches, and audited them. I mean, they, to their great credit, they filled out a very, very long survey, and then I've talked with their pastors a bunch. The majority of them had an experience like Caldwell, almost closed.
Yeah. The
majority of them were very fluent at one time and are now not as, or if at all.
Right.
And the majority of them have found the same kind of liberation. When you have one foot in the tomb, you start to get a little bit more friendly with risk and liberation, and you say, well, we better try some things. So let's throw some spaghetti up on the wall and see what sticks. And the congregations went with it. There were not the people that said, you can't do that, we've never done it that way. It was, heck yeah, let's try it. And so they became comfortable with failure. They became comfortable with risk taking. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah, very much. We know most of the cities in America are already minority majority.
That's right.
We know our nation is going to be in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. Well, the church ought to start looking like that and acting like that while it still can. And it's not. We know the PCUSA is 90% white.
Yeah.
And the racial diversity we do have is still segmented. It's homogeneous. There are white churches and there are black churches. There are very few churches that have this gift of racial diversity and indeed intersectionality. And so that was a term I had to study about, because when you mix different folks that have different experiences on the margins, it becomes a very rich mixture, but you've got to recognize that there are different types of hurts and wounds, and the two don't equate. And so that creates wonderful friction and what I call in the book a kind of a constructive tension.
Yep.
It's not for sissies, but it constantly sheds light. Say in the book, it's life at these churches is gloriously messy. It is glorious some days it is messy. Most days it's both. It's just gloriously messy. And so there is repeated dying to our old selves. It is not a singular action. And so they are doing that work, whether it is anti-racism or poverty work or LGBTQ justice or all of the above. Right. They throw all that into the pot and stir it up, and fascinating things happen. Sometimes people get bumped and bruised and wounded a little bit, and we have to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off. And so that's one of the learnings of the book. Is there's a great quote in there that these churches all, one of them just barely puts up with Presbyterian polity. Another one says it has its place because we need the book. But these churches work much more relationally. Yeah. And so, Robert's rules is in the background, and all of the things that traditional churches do, are in our quiver. But if it's not relational through thick and thin, it's harder for these churches to stick with it. And
absolutely. Well, and that's where, I think part of what you're describing is, I'm going to bring it to kind of the theological education here. Because I've experienced Caldwell as a living learning lab when I would be there in the summer with the students from Davidson and from Queens and St. Andrews, and we're all in it together. And real tears were shed, in some of those sessions that we had together. And it was because it was a relational model of theological education. It was people opening up and being vulnerable enough to shed some tears when tough things were being talked about. So that's how I've experienced Caldwell through the Gambrel, or what y'all call the Hope Social Justice Program. Now, can you talk a little bit about, you can kind of take it whichever direction you want to, your commitment to young adults, because this is not just about, people over a certain age figuring it out, right? You have a deep commitment to young people. And then would you say that that Caldwell has always had the spirit of a kind of living learning theological education lab, or do you think this is something that's emerged more recently?
I think it was there at the beginning, in part because of the mix of people that were there to reboot the church. Many, and one of the most common parts of the DNA at Caldwell is people have been hurt by the church or organized religion. And so they bring wounds or disappointments or disillusionment, or worse. And the fact that they're at Caldwell or these other churches means that they're not giving up on God. They just have some big questions for organized religion, and they work those out real time at Caldwell. And so that in turn has led to a very open spirit by the congregation, and the fact that there are some great schools right around Charlotte for us to have had like 35 interns in 15 years. So I love doing that. My colleague in ministry, Reverend Gail Henderson Belcito, now comes alongside it. She really took the lead last summer with our most recent Hope Dr. Diane Mowry, who was a chaplain at Queens, is an instrumental player. Dr. Helen Hull, an English professor at Queens, all say, let's share what we're doing with young people, and then let's listen to them. And every time we bring in, we've had 4 waves of five Gabriel scholars, or 4 to 5 per summer, and then all these other college interns, and almost constantly a seminary intern. We end up learning from them, and so there's a beautiful spirit of that they almost inherited from those blue hairs that were there, who didn't impose rules and brought an open mind and sat back and said, we want to learn from you.
Yeah.
And that has been kind of passed down in the DNA. And so, in general, there's Stephanie.
There's Steph.
Yeah, man, Pastor, you get yourself in the pulpit. It's just a funny circumstance, and it's kind of a humility before God to say, the last thing this should have ever happened was this church coming back to life. So clearly we are not in charge, and clearly we can't get, 2 yards ahead of God, or we're going to take a wrong turn. And I'm so thankful for that. Some of us need more humility than others, and I know that I've got a lot to unlearn.
Same here. Yes. That's wonderful. I've got a lot more questions, but I can save those for another time when I see you in person sometime. But let me go ahead and open it up to Q&A. Michelle, I believe you're going to moderate that, but see where it goes. And then I've got a closing question about the future of the work, but I'm going to save that right now. So I'm going to be quiet.
Hey, Terry.
It's good that you're acknowledging her, because she has asked some very good questions. So
I'm in trouble.
The Reverend Dr. Terry Ott, who is a BookTALk alum, by the way,
right.
has posed a handful of very good questions. So
now I'm nervous. If I wasn't nervous before with Tanner.
Oh, I think you'll be fine. Also, for those of you that haven't posted the questions that are burning on your mind right now, go ahead and do that in the Q&A section. So Terry asks, Caldwell Presbyterian is the most racially mixed Presbyterian church I have visited. What advice would you have for our predominantly white Presbyterian churches who desire this beautiful diversity?
Wow, it's it is very hard for a church to go from being mostly or all white, and so I acknowledge the profound difficulty of that. We were that from the reboot of Caldwell, and so we've done our best to maintain that, but that's constant work as well. I mean, I think in this day and age, and so much of the conversation around anti-racism informs this, that church leaders, pastors, elders, others have to be very prepared to flip the script and get out of the way and let new traditions and experiments roll and not sweat it. And not everybody's built that way. We Presbyterians love our traditions. We love to sing the Gloria at 11:48 every Sunday, and we need to be out by 12 and all those things. And so you just have to let go of a lot, have to diversify the pulpit as much as you possibly can. You have to diversify leadership from the front. One of the things that I remember reading, this is not new to me, was that if you want a diverse congregation, you've got to have a diverse chancel. And that's just the beginning, because then you have to empower and center people who have been on the margins. You have to listen to them, which means a lot of power people having to sit on their hands and just be quiet. I think you have to know that you don't have the answers if you're an all-white church, and you better go ask people of color. Respectfully, and not by saying, "The person of color, come save us." That's just compounding the problem. But if there are ways to bring wise voices in, and then break a lot of glass, and see what works. Each congregation will find what works. There's no overestimating the rare chance we got to start over again with a blank piece of paper. Most white churches can't do that. They've got 200, 150 years of traditions baked in to their DNA. So it's really hard. But attack it with courage, support each other, and remember that God's in charge. We're not.
I actually have a side question to that. Is it appropriate to honor some of the history and tradition? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, first of all, I would personally say I would go to some of my colleagues and my members and ask them that question, because I know I enter that question with blind spots and blinders. But absolutely, I think one of the funny kind of invisible or unspoken tests that I think about a lot at Caldwell is there better be something in every worship service that makes it somebody uncomfortable. And if we do that, we know that we're bringing different ways of thinking, talking about God, music, theology, what commentaries are being used, what is the order of worship, and so throw a lot of spaghetti up on the wall. You just have to. And I know I'm mixing my metaphors, but no, absolutely. And even though we've been at this for 15 years at Caldwell, I am certain that some of my members and leaders of color would say we've got a lot more to do to shake up the service and the culture. And so we are leaning heavily into the work of anti-racism, and that will give us a roadmap that affects everything: the worship service, how session is run, what the campus looks like, what the interior of the church looks like. We've got to push those boundaries. It's hard work and it's exhausting work, but it's profoundly transformative, when we strike on something that maybe in hindsight was a decent idea, at least for attracting diversity. And we got so much work to do. It's hard.
A lot of good work. So Terry is also asking, what about Caldwell Presbyterian is uniquely Caldwell?
That's a great question, because it sort of goes to the research findings. I'll flip the question first of all and say what was a common thread about these other intersectional diverse churches is that they're all kind of precarious. They're all a little fragile because they do bring diversity to the fore. They're open and transparent rather than a handful of people making all the decisions, and that can lead to tension and disagreement. I think for Caldwell, it's the particular narrative of the resurrection, and I think that nothing we could have done would have anticipated that God would have Caldwell not close. And so the fact that there were these two groups, the old blue-hairs, who were doing all they could to keep the church open until God did something new. And then the fact that a second corpus, a second group of people of 15 and 20 people had quite separately been borrowing a Sunday school room and reading progressive theology and wanting to see more of that in the church. And then the way they got together through this one couple, because otherwise the twain might never have met. So that's a very, very particular kind of resurrection story that's just not going to be repeated. And so, one disclaimer for the book is we know that lightning struck at 1609 East 5th Street. And you can't make lightning strike, but that's a pretty unique set of circumstances at Caldwell. But out of that, we're trying to draw broader understanding that other churches might take up, which is kind of what the book's about.
And there's a question in the chat too. I think this will be helpful. Can you talk a little bit about the worship? And Michelle, you might want to read the question.
Sure. Yeah. Cynthia Jackson. She says, please tell us about the music at Caldwell. I love ELPC, but I think that's East Liberty Presbyterian, but want to see the organ postlude where we are to sit and listen, not to talk it to anyone, discontinued.
Yeah.
After the benediction, I think we need to be the church.
Well, that's a very astute question. And again, one of the particular distinctive elements was that when Caldwell rebooted, it had the corpus of an interracial gospel choir who had sung together at another church years earlier. And they are awesome. And their leader, longtime leader, Smitty Flynn, who's a career musician, had led this choir at another church that kind of blew up years and years before. And they just wanted to be back together, and they wanted to sing together. And so they're the heart of the worship. I'm very clear. Now, my colleague's a brilliant preacher, but I'm very clear that when I'm preaching, I'm secondary to the music. It's black gospel, but then we turn the dials on it as well. And so we do the same 20 songs, Oh Happy Day, and these classics that this choir has been singing literally for decades. But then we also take up new music, Latino music. We bring in instruments. And so it's a mix. The heart of it is black gospel, but we always do one traditional hymn, a couple of black gospel pieces, and then the third one's kind of a wild card. But after the postlude, we do play our organ once a month. I'm huge on the organ. I love the organ. But we have found a gentleman who comes in and plays and loves it being followed by the amen chorus, of the gospel choir at the end of the service. So we go from a toccata to something else. And that's a big part of the learnings from the books, the churches in the book too, is that kind of range and flexibility. The pastor at Brown Memorial in Baltimore says in the book, I can preach, a perfectly put together sermon that would be a model for preaching at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and then I can turn around and do the call and response like a black pastor. I don't have that range, but you kind of have to do it all, or at least find a way to do it all. At Caldwell, that means bringing in as many diverse talents as we possibly can.
Seems like true inclusivity. What true inclusivity, requires is including everyone in the worship service as much as possible. We have another question from Jean Shadle. She asks, in an upper class, predominantly white, wealthy church west of Pittsburgh, how does our Justice Ministries team move forward?
Great question. Well, first of all, stick to it. So I don't know where they are now, but double down. If there are many books that will tell you that the people that have left the church or have one foot outside the church, the younger generations particularly care about justice. They're much more interested in seeing the church do rather than to say or to seem. And so if you want to look at it purely from a marketing standpoint, and I think that's corrupt, but know that there's a synergy there, that young people who see the church doing things in the community may come to your front doors on Sunday mornings. And so bear public witness. That's another theme of the book, is that the churches that are researched bear public witness. So at Caldwell, we march 50 or 60 or 70 people in the Pride Parade. We have a float and our choir is singing their hearts out. Just as we march in the MLK Parade, just as we march when there are protests after a police shooting. We don't do that in our Caldwell t-shirts. We do it because it's bearing witness. But then we find somebody will come along and say, I saw you doing this, or I saw you doing that, and it made me curious. And, people are not going to pour in the doors, but do it for the right reasons, do it authentically. If you don't get a new member out of it, keep doing it. But what you might find is that people are, I think, increasingly looking for the church outside of Sunday morning and beyond its campus. And we don't do it to get noticed, but we do find that that holds us to our intentions and our promises, at least.
Well, we have maybe a couple minutes left. Tanner or John, do you have any parting thoughts, or we might even have time for one last question?
There's one more question in the chat that's really interesting, from Cynthia Jackson. And one thing I think I can fold it into my question, where Cynthia's asked about how do you invite folks to meet someone new on Sunday? And I want to broaden that out just a little bit. So there's this invitation to hospitality that Cynthia's asking about. But at the same time, what's next? Tell us about the new work, the ongoing work, not the new work. It's in continuity with what you've been doing. And how that's an invitation for meeting and bringing new people into the home of Caldwell.
That's a very deftly done connection, but absolutely, this congregation is so committed, to its great credit, to radical inclusion and radical hospitality. In part because they've seen other churches hurt people, or they've been hurt by the church. And so when somebody that's been hurt by the church comes and heals, they make remarkable disciples. And so there's something very organic in the way that this congregation greets people on Sunday morning that is just very authentic. We have not ever had a task force or a committee break it down. But these are people who've come in the last 15 years from somewhere else. That means that they left somewhere else or were not in the church at all. A lot of people were not in the church at all, or they were on a long time hiatus. And so that authentic welcome kind of bubbles out of their true desire to share what they're experiencing, and you just can't bottle that. As for us, we also understand that we're stewards of a large campus that once housed an 1,100 member church, and we've used a building, 1,200 square foot, 12,000 square foot education building. Every church has an education wing. Well, that's kind of like ours. And we've used it as an incubator for lots and lots of different ministries. But as I said, about 12 years ago, we had the opportunity to be an emergency shelter for women on the streets. And what started out to be a 90-day emergency shelter lasted for 3 years. And when those women moved to the more permanent site back at the Salvation Army, it just kind of left a hole in the church's heart because they had loved getting to know the women and helping them in whatever ways they could. And so that set us out on a 10-year journey that now has us converting that whole 12,000 square foot building into 21 studio apartments, permanent supportive housing first, people chronically homeless coming directly off the streets who will live on our 1.3 acre campus. They will get case management. We're not professional social workers. We would already mess that up. So we have a lot of work to do to learn how to receive those neighbors well, without imposing ourselves, but walk alongside them. And it's simply contextual, sort of like diversity in America. Every county in America has a housing crisis. No one earning the minimum wage can afford housing in America. No one. In Charlotte, its runaway economy is white hot. And so we have 50,000 units short of affordable housing. Well, we've got 21. And so we are doing that. And that's my next book out next year. It is a growing movement. More and more churches or finding new life by getting into the housing business and finding resurrection that way. And so that's just another form of our dying to our old selves and God offering resurrection.
Awesome. Thanks,
Well,
John.
well, on that note, we're at time, so I want to honor that.
I do see one anonymous.
Yes, and I'm
question.
going to say our anonymous attendee who asked a very good question. I believe in the subject guide that Tisha created, there's contact information.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, for John. So I would email John your question. Is that good enough there, Tanner?
We love sharing. It's pastor@caldwellpresby.org.
There you go.
And if someone wants to type that into the chat, 704-957-4511. I was joking with folks that the publisher of the book has knocked the price down to $5, which I hope is not a reflection of what they think of it, but it's a cheap buy right now. And so if you don't like dealing with Amazon, and some people don't, you can get it cheaper at Fortress Press, or just Google the name and it should take you to Fortress Press. It's a $5 sale right now. So
Buy 3.
All right. Well, thank you to the Reverend Dr. John Cleghorn and Dr. Tanner Capps for an excellent conversation. And thanks to all of you for participating in this conversation. Have a good night.
thank you.
See you, John. See everybody.
Thank you all so much.